The first thing Garrett did after being marooned was urinate in the reactor coolant. Not out of spite, not exactly, but after 36 hours of walking in circles inside a crumbling alien repair station where every console blinked error in languages he didn't speak and nobody answered his comms. Garrett figured the base owed him something. Hydration recycling was offline, and the coolant line was warm. It hissed like a dying tea kettle and smelled faintly of citrus, which he found weirdly encouraging. Bet the Zarks won't see that on the diagnostics. He zipped up and continued his slow patrol through the North Maintenance Ring, chewing the same dried meat ration he'd gnawed on since yesterday. The synthetic stuff had the flavor profile of plastic soaked in brine, but it had protein. Protein and time were now his two most abundant resources. Garrett Lorne, certified shipboard mechanic, Class B hull engineer, and reluctant guest of Outpost 17 Beta. The place was supposed to be an interspecies refueling depot, maintained jointly by four of the Galactic Accord's more bureaucratic members. In theory, it was a marvel of cross-species cooperation. In practice, it had more rust than an Earthside scrapyard and fewer functional systems than a Neolithic cave. They'd left him behind during the evacuation. He wasn't sure if that had been a clerical error or something more deliberate. Zark's command didn't exactly hand out daily updates to the humans contracted under temporary repair provisions. The aliens had panicked over some long-range scanner anomaly and cleared out in under an hour, loading up their shuttles with servers and biocore data, but not the guy in the crawl space rewiring their waste filtration logic. "Can't evacuate what you don't log," Garrett muttered to himself. He passed a shattered interface panel. Someone had pried it off in a hurry, probably thinking it housed something valuable. Garrett squinted at the wiring behind it. The base still had power, dim and flickering though it was. That meant the core was still intact. Fusion reactors were touchy, sure, but not suicidal. If the reactor was holding steady, there was no reason the whole station had to be falling apart, unless no one had maintained it for 6 months, or 6 years. Garrett entered the old hydroponics bay. The station's environmental systems had once kept this sector lush. Well, relatively lush. Now it was silent. Lights overhead blinked in failure patterns. Vines hung brittle and brown over long dry irrigation troughs. And the smell was something between stale metal and rotted kelp. He stood there a long moment, then walked over to the central environmental hub. The console was alien in design, but not unfamiliar. He'd serviced hybrid systems before. Tri-modal interface, redundant circuitry, standardized during the Third Accord Treaty to streamline cross-race logistics. He pried open the access panel with his boot knife. Underneath the console, wires sagged like intestines. Most were misrouted or fused. Someone had done a slapdash patch job, maybe to reroute air to one of the more essential sectors during the evacuation. Maybe they hadn't expected anyone to ever come back. "Good news," Garrett said aloud. "Your thermostat's only mostly fried." He spent the next 3 hours splicing and rerouting. He used wire from a defunct door servo and spools of connector line he'd scavenged from the shuttle bay's debris. He bypassed the core temperature regulator completely, letting the hydro loop feed off ambient thermals. It wouldn't be ideal, but it would cycle again. The moisture reclamator might even kick back on, which meant the hum returned. It started as a low vibration through the floor, then climbed, resonant and alive. The first irrigation line pulsed, and a short hiss of water sprayed from a ruptured seam. Garrett grinned despite himself. He flicked his comm. "Station log, timestamp 167 by Accord standard. Environmental subsystem partially restored. Primary loop A6 online. This concludes my very lonely TED Talk." No response. Of course. He wandered back into the corridor, suddenly conscious of how quiet everything was. In the early days of his contract, there had been shouting in 6 languages, boots on grates, and the clatter of service drones. Now, silence. A silence he could fill. The base wasn't just broken, it was forgotten. But a mechanic's brain didn't accept forgotten as a category. Machines didn't forget. They just failed. And Garrett had fixed failing machines his whole life. He found a storage room on level 3 that hadn't been looted. Inside, spare circuit boards, a collapsed cleaning bot, 2 sealed ration crates, and 3 full canisters of filtered air. Jackpot. He dragged the crates into what used to be a minor transit terminal and set up camp. One side of the room had a long, curved viewport where you could just barely see the silver-black shimmer of the planet's upper atmosphere. Garrett sat against the wall, chewing silently, watching a storm roll over the horizon below. Lightning flickered in thin, arcing trails. He felt a strange calm watching it. The station didn't need to be operational. No one was coming back for it. There were no evacuation shuttles on the manifest, no search teams. The Accord had probably written the whole thing off as a budgetary casualty, maybe even as scuttled. But Garrett wasn't dead. He wasn't gone. And every bolt, switch, and cable on this base had been meant to do something. Just because the galaxy didn't care didn't mean the machine didn't still want to run. He stood. He had power. He had tools. He had time. And he had a very long list of things that should be working. Tomorrow he'd start with the reactor room. Garrett didn't sleep that night, not really. The station groaned too much, expanding and contracting with heat shifts, creaking metal joints, venting air from who knew where. It was like sharing a room with an asthmatic animal the size of a building. Still, when the dim blue lights of morning cycle flickered on, he was already upright, wrapping the last of the wire coils into a makeshift belt and jamming his toolkit shut. If the core was intact, everything else was just logistics. If it wasn't, he'd need to figure out how to not explode. Either way, it was going to be a productive morning. The reactor wing sat beneath 3 blast-shielded floors, past 2 layers of biometric locks, and a blast door the size of a dropship. The biometric layers were dead now. No power and no one left to authorize anything. The door, however, remained stubborn. 10 inches of composite plating designed to withstand orbital bombardment. Garrett stood in front of it, chewing a piece of jerky thoughtfully. He remembered a maintenance tunnel that ran under it, originally designed for coolant overflow inspection. The Zark's engineers had sealed it off when the AOI started mistaking the smell of humans for system breaches. Something about protein chains triggering hazard sensors. The fix had been to reroute the humans above ground entirely. Typical. He backtracked to level -2, found the old vent shaft and dropped in. The tunnel was narrow, clearly not built for human shoulders, and slick with old residue that smelled like melted batteries. He had to crawl most of the way, dragging his pack behind him. After 20 meters, the shaft opened into the lower reactor alcove, and there it was, the core. It hummed low, alive but not happy. Dim warning lights blinked along its outer casing. Temperature variance in red. Backup regulators marked as offline. Power cycling held in failsafe mode. The entire station was running on less energy than a civilian escape pod. Garrett knelt beside the main interface node and opened the panel. Alien wiring, yes, but he'd worked on worse. He mapped out the circuit tree, traced the fault back to a corroded junction box, and bypassed it using repurposed thermocouple clamps from a burnout server hub. He muttered to himself while he worked, not for company, but to fill the air. Cold junction's dead. No wonder she's limping. That's not even shielding. That's bubble wrap and luck. He pried open the junction, rerouted its feed to the thermocoupler, and manually reset the core to stable mode. The reactor lights blinked once, flickered, and steadied. The hum deepened. Panels across the alcove lit in cascade. Readouts updated in real time. Energy flows adjusted and recalibrated. The station's heart was beating again. Garrett sat back against the wall and let out a long breath. He stayed there for several minutes, watching. Some lights were still out. Some modules weren't responding. But the reactor was no longer limping. It was working. Underfed, but stable. He pulled a data pad from his bag and began compiling a repair log. Not because anyone would read it, but because that's what you did when you brought something back to life. You made a record. You marked the line between before and after. He flipped through the subsystems the moment he got uplink again. Air filtration, sealed and non-responsive. Gravity modulation, suboptimal but operational. Long-range comms, still dead. Docking bay pressure sensors were blinking errors, but at least they were blinking. And to Garrett, blinking meant hope. He climbed back out of the crawl space, filthy but energized. The base wasn't just functional now, it was waking up. Over the next 3 days, Garrett reactivated the water recyclers, jury-rigged a fuel gauge bypass, and resynced the heating coils in the crew quarters. He fixed broken lights with pieces of hull insulation, patched pressure leaks with deactivated drone armor, and scavenged parts from 6 dead consoles to rebuild one working one. He ate ration bars cold and slept in a hammock he built from wire netting and fire-retardant cloth. His beard was growing and patchy and his eyes were red, but he felt better than he had in months. For once, he wasn't just fixing what others broke. He was building something new, even if it was from garbage. Then came the drones. He found the first one in a storage closet, dormant and missing its leg modules. A maintenance unit, S-Class, designed for hull inspections. The thing looked like an upside-down horseshoe crab with a flashlight bolted to its face. He dragged it out, patched the power cell, and wired its motor cortex into a diagnostic loop. It clicked once, then twice, then lifted its head. "Welcome back," Garrett said. "Hope you're not homicidal." The drone scanned him, then emitted a long tone. "Good enough." He spent the rest of the day reactivating 2 more drones. One had a cracked optics array and spun in circles. The other could barely hover but beeped cheerfully whenever it passed near Garrett. He named them Lefty, Blip, and Torque. By the 4th day, they followed him through the halls, ferrying tools and spare parts. He taught Torque to hold a light steady while he rewired the atmospheric scrubbers. Lefty mostly just bumped into things, but Blip learned to run system checks. It was absurd, but it was working. The base was no longer just a ruin. It was a machine again, one with Garrett at its center. The 5th day started with a tremor. Not a big one, just enough to make Garrett pause mid-bite and glance up at the ceiling of the comms tower, where dust sifted lazily through a fractured vent. Torque had chirped and spun twice in place, his gyro unsettled. Blip retreated under the nearest bench like a startled animal. Garrett stood slowly, chewing the rest of his protein bar. He wiped his hands on his jumpsuit and tapped the terminal he'd patched together from half a navigation console and a piece of cafeteria wall. "Seismic log," he muttered. "No entry. No alerts in the station's internal sensors. No external events registered. No incoming ships. No geological instability from the planet below," which meant it came from inside. The tremor had felt distant, deep, almost like pressure shifting in an old pipe. But he didn't like surprises. Not here. Not when everything else had started humming along. He called up the base schematics. Much of the lower tier remained red-zoned, flagged as inaccessible, which probably meant broken and no one wanted to fix it. The seismic wave, weak as it was, seemed to originate somewhere beneath sublevel 8. Garrett looked over at Blip. "Time for a field trip." Sublevel 8 wasn't on any of the typical routes. It required bypassing a collapsed freight shaft, navigating a vent corridor that had clearly once hosted some sort of hungry mold, and squeezing through a half-welded door frame left sealed since long before Garrett had arrived. By the time he reached the hall, even Blip had stopped following, electing instead to hover anxiously just out of range. Garrett moved forward alone. The corridor walls were scorched, as though something electrical had vented and kept venting for days. Faint scratches lined the floor, like drag marks, or maybe the result of something wheeled and overloaded being pulled through in a hurry. The lighting was dead, no flickers, no buzz, just darkness and the scent of static. He flicked on his shoulder lamp. Ahead, the hallway opened into a small square chamber. There were no active terminals here, no drone ports or storage crates, only a hatch in the floor, marked in the jagged script of the Zarks. He recognized one of the words, containment. Garrett crouched beside it. The hatch was sealed with old magnetic locks, no power running to them now. He ran a low-frequency probe over the frame. No traps, no recent activity. But the lock had been reinforced. Not original design. Someone had wanted this shut long after the base had stopped caring. Garrett debated, then snorted to himself. "I'm a mechanic, not a philosopher." He pulled a micro-cutter from his belt, jammed it into the seam, and started slicing. The hatch opened with a final hiss of displaced air. Cool, dry, and old. Inside, a drop shaft, maybe 10 meters down. He descended using a line spool from the drone bay and landed in what looked like a data vault. The room was filled with black pillars, servers of some kind alien and humming with the faintest whisper of retained charge. At the far end stood a tall, sealed cylinder, wired into the floor with dozens of cables. Garrett approached slowly. The cylinder wasn't just storage, it was a pod. Reinforced, armored, and suspended in a field of insulating gel that had dried and cracked over time. The power cell attached to it was long dead, but one of the auxiliary lines was still drawing a trickle from the station core. He scanned the markings. None were in accord standard, but a few had the triangular glyphs used in pre-collapse Zark's military designations. Why would they store a military pod under a fuel depot? He muttered. And why keep it running after everything else got pulled? He traced the wires. Several ran to block subsystems, sealed protocols he hadn't even known existed. Others disappeared into the bulkhead behind the pod, into places the schematics had never mentioned. He considered activating the backup, and chose not to. Instead, he cut the auxiliary power feed, gently, deliberately, then logged the action on his pad with a timestamp and his own ID. The pod powered down entirely. The room dimmed. Whatever was here, it would stay here, for now. Back in the upper levels, Garrett took a longer route to return, making sure the tremor hadn't caused any visible damage. Blip rejoined him halfway up the stairwell and emitted a hopeful tone, like a question mark with wings. "No idea what we just found," Garrett said, "but it wasn't meant for me." He spent the evening rerouting power from the sealed lower vault. The extra charge allowed him to bring the forward comms dish out of hibernation mode for the first time since arriving. The thing shuddered as it realigned, like it hadn't moved in years. One of the rotary gears cracked during the adjustment, but he patched it using parts from a defunct drone housing. The signal boost worked. Sort of. He didn't get messages from the Accord, but he did pick up something. A faint ping. Not a distress call, not standard traffic. Just a 3-second burst repeating every 2 minutes from somewhere out beyond the fourth moon. No encryption, no signature, just a ping. Garrett logged it, then turned to Blip. "Someone's out there." Garrett spent the next 2 days triangulating the signal. He used the dish to sweep the outer moons, bouncing the pings off station debris and dead satellites like a blind man clicking in a cave. The result was slow, maddening work. The signal never changed. Same 3-second burst, same delay. It didn't even contain data. No language, no audio. Just a pulse. It was either ancient and broken or intentional and watching, and Garrett didn't like being watched. He logged every ping into a rolling file and built a probability map of its origin. The center of the pattern? A long-abandoned mining platform tethered in a decaying orbit around the fourth moon. Accord registries listed it as decommissioned over a decade ago, and none of the former tenants had claimed it during the evacuation, which meant it shouldn't be transmitting anything. "Time to make a call," Garrett muttered. He climbed back up to the main comms deck, rerouted auxiliary power, and did what he'd been avoiding for 2 weeks. He sent a broad-range signal out to space. He didn't call for help. That would have been optimistic. He didn't bother with diplomacy either. His message was short, clear, and aimed directly at whoever had been sending the ping. "Unknown transmitter. This is Technician Garrett Lorne of Accord Outpost 17 Beta. I have reactivated the station. I've detected your signal. Respond or cease transmission. You're spooking the drones." He sent it on all major frequencies, then waited. 1 hour, then 2. No response. Then in hour 3, the ping stopped. Not replaced, not corrupted. It simply ceased. Garrett waited another 6 hours before he spoke again, this time addressing the silence directly. "I've shut down containment in the lower vault. I know what's down there. I didn't touch it. Not planning to. Whatever your interest is, it's not mine." Again, no reply. But the next morning, there was motion on the long-range scanner. 1 blip, then 3, then 7. Ships. No broadcast IDs, no approach vectors, just presence. Quiet, unannounced, and closing. Garrett stood in the main corridor, watching the display on the monitor above his console. They weren't Accord. They weren't scavengers either. Too clean, too coordinated. "They're coming for the vault," he said, mostly to himself. He tapped a command key and activated all internal surveillance drones. Torque and Blip zipped into motion. Lefty hit a wall, reversed, and hit the opposite wall. Garrett smiled, then started locking down the newly repaired bulkheads. He wasn't going to fight. That was a different kind of story, but he wasn't going to make it easy either. By the time the first boarding party entered the station, the lights were dimmed and the halls were cold. Automated servos buzzed in strange patterns, drawing attention away from the key sectors. Blip released trace heat signatures to confuse body scans. Lefty deployed a full can of black repair foam across a stairwell, causing two of the intruders to slip and crash into each other. Garrett, meanwhile, had relocated to the vault shaft. He stood beside the dormant pod, one hand on the manual reactivation switch. His other hand held a datapad with the transmission logs. The first of the intruders reached the corridor above. The figure paused at the hatch, backlit by the glow of an alien visor. Garrett didn't flinch. "This isn't your station," he said. The figure didn't speak but moved forward. Garrett flipped a breaker. The pod hissed, not to open, but to eject the core wiring into the wall. The whole system shorted in an instant. The containment field surged and collapsed. The pod inside would never be powered again. "You're not getting it," Garrett said, turning to face the figure fully. "You don't even know what it is." The figure took another step, then stopped. Behind it, Blip buzzed to life and emitted a sudden, high-pitched distress tone, one specifically designed to simulate a reactor breach. Emergency lights snapped on. The boarding party scrambled. In the chaos, the figure backed off, disappearing into the smoke. Garrett left the vault chamber behind him and sealed the shaft. By the time he returned to the surface deck, the ships had already begun their retreat. No shots fired, no explosions. Just quiet withdrawal, like something had shifted and no longer made sense to them. Like a man standing calmly in front of a reactor pod, alone and unarmed, had unsettled them more than any weapon would. He spent the next week rebuilding. The vault remained sealed. He removed all power feeds, stripped the wiring, and used the space to store extra tools. He converted the forward dormitory into a hydroponics chamber. The food was slow to grow but reliable. The drones multiplied. Blip learned to manage diagnostics without Garrett's supervision. And finally, the station broadcast again. Not a ping, not a distress call, just a quiet, looped message. "This station is active, repaired, functional. Crew, 1, awaiting assignment." Garrett sat on the edge of the old viewport, now clean and unobstructed, legs dangling over the grating. He had no intention of leaving. The station had once been dead. Now it lived. It worked, because a mechanic made it work, and maybe that was enough.